I'm your host, Maria. Welcome back to Moral Drift, a podcast that examines ethical leadership and why some leaders stick to their values while others spiral and drift away from their moral compass. Last episode, we talked about how ethical leadership is shaped by emotional intelligence, the psychology of moral decision-making, and nature versus nurture. Why some leaders choose the ethical path while others do not. But today we're getting into the shadowy side, power. Power changes us, sometimes in ways we don't even realize. Let's explore how authority can challenge or corrupt even the most well-meaning leaders, how they rationalize their unethical behavior, and why some leaders are able to resist the pull of power. In psychology, power is known to reduce empathy and increase risk-taking. But this isn't just about bad intentions. It's about how power literally changes the way people think, feel, and behave. When someone gains power, their ability to focus on others' perspectives tends to diminish. They're more likely to act impulsively, take ethical shortcuts, and assume they're above the rules. I'm sure you've all come across someone like that. Power often creates psychological distance from those being led, and this detachment can open the door to moral disengagement, where harming others no longer feels wrong or even registers emotionally. Researchers have found that people in power are more prone to interrupt, dominate conversations, overestimate their abilities, and underestimate risks. You don't have to look far to see this in real life. For example, take Enron, the energy company we talked about in the last episode. Once one of the most admired companies in the world, in 2001, it collapsed under the weight of fraud, ego, and unchecked executive power. Remember Jeff Skilling? The people at the top didn't start out intending to commit massive fraud. Well, at least we don't think they did. But over time, their power insulated them from reality and accountability until lying became routine and risk felt like strategy. When we talk about how power can corrupt people, two classic psychology experiments really stand out. They aren't just historical case studies at this point. They've shaped decades, and I mean decades, of understanding about authority, obedience, and human nature. The first experiment is the Stanford prison experiment. It's pretty infamous. I'm not sure if you've heard of it before, but it was run by psychologist Philip Zimbardo in 1971. Zimbardo set up a mock prison in the basement of Stanford's psychology building and recruited college students to play either guards or prisoners. The plan was to run the study for 2 weeks, but they had to shut it down just after 6 days. Why? Because the students who were assigned as guards started becoming disturbingly abusive towards the quote-unquote prisoners. They used psychological torment, enforced humiliating punishments, and showed a complete lack of empathy. The experiment revealed that when you give people power, even normal people with no history of cruelty, they can quickly slip into authoritarian and even sadistic behavior. It wasn't that they were necessarily bad people. It was the situation and the power dynamics that changed them. So then the second study we can look at is Stanley Milgram's, another famous psychologist who was curious about obedience. In the early 1960s, he designed the Milgram Obedience Study. In his experiment, participants thought they were helping to test the effects of punishment on learning. Really, they weren't. They were told to administer increasingly severe electric shocks to another person who was actually an actor. Every time the actor got their answer wrong, they screamed in pain or pleaded for shocks to stop. But if a stern figure in a lab coat would simply say, "Please continue," the person administering would continue. 65% of participants obeyed all the way to the highest voltage, even when they thought they might be seriously harming someone. Milgram's study showed how ordinary people can commit harmful acts, not because they're evil, but because they're following authority and feel less personally responsible for their actions. Now let's add another layer. You have average everyday people, but there are certain personality traits that are already prone to manipulative, cold, or self-centered behavior. The so-called dark triad. These include narcissism, which might be a little overly used nowadays, especially with the internet, social media. It seems like everyone's ex is a narcissist. But the definition of it is having an inflated sense of self-importance and entitlement. Machiavellianism, which is being strategic, manipulative, and willing to deceive to get what you want. And then there's psychopathy, showing little empathy, remorse, or guilt, and being impulsive or thrill-seeking. When people high in these traits gain power, the risks are even greater. A 2024 study by Pina and colleagues warned us that organizations often mistake these qualities for strength, praising someone for being ruthless, bold, or decisive, while overlooking the damage they cause. The study found that leaders with dark triad traits tend to manipulate, exploit others, and emotionally detach from the consequences of their actions. A recipe for moral disengagement. You don't have to look far to see how this plays out. In our introduction to the first episode, we mentioned Elizabeth Holmes, the former CEO of Theranos, who built a $9 billion biotech startup on promises she couldn't keep. She projected a vision of transformation and innovation, but behind the scenes, her leadership reflected clear elements of narcissism and Machiavellianism. These are overconfidence, secrecy, manipulation of data, and the silencing of whistleblowers. Investors and media praised her as visionary until the truth unraveled. Her case is a stark example of what happens when dark triad traits and power go unchecked. Ethical corners are cut, truth is sacrificed, and people get hurt. So when you put all this together, the natural corrupting influence of power, the human tendency to obey authority, and the toxic traits that some organizations reward, it becomes clear. Ethical leadership doesn't happen by accident. It takes constant vigilance, humility, and the courage to question yourself and your own motives. But understanding how power and personality can corrupt is only part of the picture. The next challenge is even more subtle. How do leaders rationalize unethical behavior to themselves? It's rarely as simple as deciding, I'm going to do something wrong. Instead, people often find ways to justify their actions, convincing themselves that what they're doing is necessary, harmless, or maybe even noble. Let's take a closer look at the psychology behind how leaders morally disengage and the mental tricks they use to excuse their bad behavior. One of the most powerful mechanisms at play is cognitive dissonance. The psychological discomfort we feel when our actions conflict with our values or self-image. Most people want to see themselves as ethical, principled, and fair. So when leaders do something questionable, like falsifying numbers, covering up a mistake, or exploiting a loophole, that internal conflict of cognitive dissonance kicks in. To resolve the tension, they don't always change the behavior. They change the narrative, what they tell themselves about what is happening. It's not really wrong. Everyone does it. I'm doing this to protect the company. These justifications ease the discomfort and allow the unethical behavior to continue unchecked. Take Enron again. It didn't collapse because of one massive failure. It unraveled through a series of smaller decisions, each rationalized as justifiable. Executives told themselves they were innovating, protecting shareholders, staying competitive. But those rationalizations became the slippery slope. What started as bending the rules eventually became breaking them. And in the absence of accountability, the internal narrative, the self-deception, kept growing stronger. That's the chilling part, or at least what I find chilling. When power combines with psychological defense mechanisms like cognitive dissonance, it becomes all too easy to drift from your moral compass without even realizing it. But luckily, not every leader succumbs. Some find a way to resist the pull, and it all starts with knowing themselves. Some leaders manage to hold on to their moral compass, even when it's easier not to. The leaders who resist aren't magically immune to corruption. They're usually the ones who are deeply self-aware. Hint, hint, emotional intelligence. They recognize that power can warp judgment, so they make a conscious effort to check themselves. They actively look for their blind spots, question their own motives, and invite honest feedback, even when it's uncomfortable. They build a system of accountability around them with clear rules, ethical advisors, and transparency. They surround themselves with people who challenge them, not just flatterers who say what they want to hear. But another common thread is humility. True ethical leaders understand that leadership is not about clinging to power. It's about service, the greater good. For example, Malala Yousafzai, a Pakistani activist who, as a young teenager, risked her life by speaking out for girls' right to education under Taliban rule. After surviving a brutal assassination attempt at the age of 15, she could have retreated into private life. Instead, in the UK, Malala chose to keep fighting, using her voice on the world stage to champion education and human rights. She doesn't chase fame. She uses her influence to elevate others, showing that real leadership is about courage, sacrifice, and staying anchored to your values. And whether it's on a global stage or within powerful institutions, standing up when it would be easier, safer, and more profitable to stay silent takes real courage. Reformers and whistleblowers like Frances Haugen, the former Facebook employee who risked her career to expose how the platform's practices harmed public trust, show that speaking truth to power isn't weakness. It's one of the highest forms of moral leadership, and it's often what keeps organizations and societies from sliding into deeper corruption. Resisting corruption isn't easy, It takes self-awareness, strong systems, humility, consistently reaching Kohlberg's final stage of moral development, and above all, the courage to put principle before personal gain. Have you ever been in a position of power, even a small one? Ask yourselves, have you been a team leader, a manager? How did you handle that responsibility? Have you ever felt the pull of power and found yourself bending the truth to justify it? Did you feel that inner conflict, that cognitive dissonance, and shift the story to make it seem right? Power ultimately reveals who we are, and every choice shapes the leader we're becoming. On the next episode, we'll invite a guest to the table and talk about what ethical leadership looks like in today's world. With AI, climate change, globalization, how do we lead with ethics when the world is moving so fast? Power amplifies who we are. So ask yourself, when the spotlight hits, will your conscience hold its ground? I'm your host, Maria, and this is Moral Drift. Thank you. See you next time.